Welcome to Culture Talk. This is the segment where we discuss culturally relevant topics that you can use to start conversations about your faith. We're addressing an important topic today, and here to help me address that is pastor and philosopher George Haraksin. You're also on RTB staff.
Yeah, it's been fun to be part of the team.
Yeah, well, thank you for joining me. Mm-hmm. You know, something that we've seen in the news a lot is we see a lot of, we've seen some key prominent Christian leaders walk away from their faith or kind of publicly struggle with their faith. Like, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I think in the media culture that we have today, there's more of a focus on those things, and sometimes we may tend to hyper-focus on it, and it can give the impression that there's sort of droves leaving the church, but I think we also want to acknowledge that, we want to listen to them, hear what they're saying, take that in, but we also want to have perspective, I think. There's many writers today, sociologists, that show that Christianity is exploding around the world, and not just surviving in the United States, but it's actually thriving in certain places. So we want to gain perspective and not say droves are leaving the church. There's sort of a myth of a dying church, and that's really not the case. However, I don't want to downplay the struggles that we see in these persons' lives.
Right, and so in your experience as a pastor, you've seen kind of the reasons that people walk away from their faith. And what are some of the core reasons why that you've seen?
Well, some of it has to do with, I make a distinction between some emotional problems and intellectual problems. People suffer a tragedy, they pray for someone, they don't get healed. Other times they're wrestling with the intellectual side. How can an all-good, all-powerful God allow suffering, whether it's in my personal life or we just have unprecedented access to the world now where everything could be fine in my neck of the woods, but I watch YouTube or look on social media and there's chaos and there's suffering. I have unprecedented access to these things. So I can almost create more burden for myself these days, even if my particular local family is doing fine.
Right. So you mentioned both emotional and intellectual kind of obstacles. Let's look first at the emotional. How would you address that if someone comes to you?
Yeah. Well, I want to make sure that we're on the same page with our words. Emotional problem and the intellectual problem are different in this sense. The emotional problem deals with the weight and the burden someone is experiencing, and they want that lifted out of their life. Whereas the intellectual problem, you're struggling with the rational compatibility of one suffering of the suffering you see out there and the reality of a good and all-powerful, all-knowing God. So, and with that, you want to give rational, logical answers. So we approach those a little bit differently. With one, I put on my pastor hat or my friend hat, my counselor hat. With the other, I put on my philosopher, theologian hat, deal with those, even though they're always intertwined. With the emotional problem, especially when I was pastoring, they give descriptions of the nones, dones, and no ways, right? So they don't want to affiliate with church, or they're just done, or it's just absolutely no way. And a lot of times people are experiencing some emotional, moral weight. With one of the leaders that we were talking about, to struggle with a marriage perhaps. It might be emotionally relating to the pressures that they're experiencing in life. So there you're dealing with the burdens and how the burdens have to be lifted, even though it's going to be intertwined with some intellectual issues as well. But we have to, I think, address those a little bit differently.
Right. So if someone comes to you and they're struggling intellectually, then how would you begin to address that? And what would you recommend doing, and what would you recommend not doing?
Yeah, when someone is struggling with an intellectual problem, they don't want a hug.
Right.
They want a logical hug. They want to get in.
Logical hug.
That's why I call it a logical hug. They want to get in and wrestle with the issues, the ideas. They have what I call intellectual dissonance, right? It's like when you used to have a bad map to going somewhere. When your map doesn't work, you get frustrated, you have dissonance, right? You want harmony back. And so you want to be able to address those questions with with some deep answers that people have. And just one case, I had a Mormon family live across the street from me. Their mom tragically died of cancer when she was rather young. They had 6 kids. The 3 that were still at home, after she passed away, they would come and knock on my door. And they would come in and want to talk about the issues. Of course, they were experiencing the emotional side of it, but they wanted to address the theology, the compatibility of their beliefs in God. And we had a very, very good time talking about those intellectual issues in a safe emotional environment.
Right.
They weren't able to talk to their family at that time.
Yeah, and it brings me back to really the heart of Reasons to Believe, the ministry that supports this show, that really we think of 1 Peter 3:15 and 16, that we always want to be prepared to give reason for the hope that we have. And sometimes that reason is emotional reasons, and sometimes it's intellectual. So what are some tools then for people if they want to help someone, or if they themselves are struggling emotionally or intellectually? How would you, what would you encourage them to do?
Yeah, I think we need in our lives, and sometimes it's hard to find them, but this is why Reasons is here. This is why I think pastors are here, hopefully philosophers. We need guides in life. A friend of mine is a professional mountain guide. He just went up Everest a couple years ago, takes people on these huge trips. But one thing I noticed, what he does is he minimizes risk, but allows people to go on a journey. It's a struggle, but he's been there before, and he knows that it's still risk. It has some risk, but he knows where to go, how to do it, and he can bring others along. We need intellectual and emotional guides, people who have kind of been there before. We can point out that people have answered some of these questions. We've wrestled with it for not just centuries, millennia, 2 millennia or more. So there are answers out there, and people have gone through it emotionally. There's other people who have gone through the struggles that we have had.
Well, thank you so much for that, George. It's really encouraging to know that we're not alone, that this has been a struggle for millennia, and people have found answers. Thank you so much for that.
You're welcome.
If you'd like to hear more from George Haraksin, visit reasons.org and search for George Haraksin.